Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Diverse Ed World Book Day event. We have hosted this event for the last 4 years as a way to celebrate all of the authors from our network. I'm a former English teacher. I love reading, and I think it's really important for us to be celebrating the brilliant authors and writers in our network to make sure you know who they are, what they're writing, to get their books on your library shelves for your pupils and for your staff as well. So in panel one, we are going to be exploring the loose theme, the umbrella theme of diversity in schools. And I'm joined by the authors and co-authors of 4 texts. We have Adam and Joe from Pride and Progress. We're going to talk about co-writing, co-editing a book. We have Naomi here, who is one half of the Evans sisters, and she's going to talk about the book that she wrote with her sister. We have Orlene here, and we have Rachel here. So 4 brilliant books for you to find out all about. The panel format's going to be each author, authors are going to have 5 minutes to talk to you about their book. So please put comments and questions in the chat, because there'll be a Q&A after each panel. So Adam and Joe, over to you, tag team extraordinaire from Pride and Progress. Tell us all about the book that I know has won lots of awards since you published it as well.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm Joe, half of Pride and Progress, and my colleague Adam, I'm sure we'll talk in a moment. Pride and Progress, if you don't know, is a podcast and a community group that amplifies the voices of LGBT+ educators. And we began our life as a podcast, having conversations about how we can make schools more inclusive. And afterwards, we'd been running the podcast and the platform for a number of years when a publisher reached out to us and asked if we'd be interested to develop that podcast, that work, into a book. Adam, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how we went about that.
Yeah, so it was a great adventure. We had 6 months to write the book, so it was a very, very busy time. And when the publisher approached us, they'd already published some books for other podcasts, so they sent us some copies of those books and said, "Oh, would you like to publish something like this?" And the books had been sent. They were great, but they were predominantly sort of transcripts of podcasts with some thoughts. And while they're great books, we wanted to write something a little bit different. So we wanted to really amplify the voices from our Pride and Progress network, because we thought that was so important, those authentic lived experiences. But we also wanted to combine what we thought were our skills from the podcast. So what we decided to do was look at all the podcast episodes and come up with what we thought were 10 key themes, 10 keys to unlocking this idea of an LGBT+ inclusive space within our schools. So we picked 10 topics for our chapters, and then each chapter we separated into 3 sections. So I might let Joe talk a little bit about how we sort of divided up each chapter.
Yeah, that's right. Adam and I kind of take these natural roles in the podcast where Adam is the intelligent one, perhaps the academic, the one that is well aware of all the research and the theory that underpins the work that we do. And I think I'm just a nice storyteller. And we kind of translated those roles into the book as well. So each chapter is split up to in theory, in practice, and in action. So we talk about what that concept looks like in theory, looking at the research and the theory that underpins that. Adam writes that part of the chapter. I then talk about what that looks like in practice, applying that theory and that research into our schools, into our classrooms. And that's we weave that together using the voices and the lived experiences of all of the guests on our podcast. So you get to hear from a number of LGBT+ educators about their experiences. And then afterwards, at the end of each chapter, there's an in-action section, which has a number of questions that you can then take into your schools and trying to put that theory and that practice into action in your classrooms.
Yeah, and it's been, it was released last year during Pride Month, which is a very nice time to launch the book. And like you said a moment ago, Hannah, we've had some amazing responses to the book. We've been really blown away by the response from people, which has been really lovely. And I think the crucial things for us was, first of all, it's quite a small book. As you can see, it's in like 140 pages. So we know that teachers are busy. We know that they haven't always got that amount of time. So the chapters are very, very short. They're sort of very rich in that research. And I think that's important because we know what it's like sometimes. You go into school, you have a conversation with an SLT member, and perhaps they don't see the significance or the importance of the work you're trying to do. So I think each part of that chapter gives that little bit of quote unquote credibility. But I think the voices then give that importance of empathy and understanding. And that really is the key to this work, as we all know. And I think that's the great response we've had from people that have read this book, how they've combined those two things, and then taken those questions at the end of each chapter to really sort of have really practical, implementable things they can do within their practice. And it's been so lovely to hear some of the responses we've got from that, isn't it, Joe?
Yeah, the final thing I would say is that Adam is a secondary school teacher and now academic working at university. I'm a primary school teacher, and the voices are really varied. So we hope that it's a book that is useful to all educators, whether they are early years, primary, secondary, higher or further education. And the goal really was to set out to try and create a handbook that educators can use to meaningfully make their schools more inclusive for LGBT plus people.
I'm not sure how full time that we possibly have, yeah.
But I was going to say very succinct. Thank you both of you for doing the work together, because we'll talk about that more probably in the Q&A about how you found that partnership. But for the brilliant work you've both done. And I think it's interesting to think about this idea of the podcast through to the book as well, and like the kind of the voice in those two spaces. So we'll move on. We'll definitely come back to some of that in the Q&A. So let me welcome Naomi, who's going to move us from thinking about LGBTQI inclusion in schools to anti-racism in schools and in wider society. So welcome, Naomi, and over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here this evening. Hannah said my name's Naomi, and I'm one half of an organisation called Everyday Racism, which I run with my sister, who unfortunately can't be here with us this evening, but she's entrusted me to talk about the book. So here's a copy of our book. It's actually our second book, but our first book for young people. So it's called Everyday Action and Everyday Change. Stay positive and motivated in the fight against racism and prejudice. And really the sort of journey of writing the book came in I guess a similar way to Joe and Adam, in the sense that we were putting content out on our Instagram page and were approached by publishers about developing that content. And the thing that I'm a teacher as well. I still work as a secondary school teacher, and I've got two children who are primary school age. And I think one of the things that I often observe is that there are people that really want to put these things into practice, but often they're like, where do I start? Like, what resource do I use? And for me, I was thinking about my 10-year-old son and how much he loves to sort of discuss these issues and things. And I was like, actually, I'd really love to write a book that he would be able to access and read independently, but equally it would be really helpful for his teachers as well, particularly, you know, people that don't experience racism. It's a way for them to really kind of get that kind of foundational learning. And so I think the book kind of does two things really, but within that, we wanted to make the book as intersectional as possible. So we have included other types of discrimination and prejudice. And the book kind of just takes you on a journey of the different ways that people are marginalized and how we can be good friends, good allies to those people in our lives. And it takes the format of different chapters explaining those things. So we look at ableism, we look at racism, we look at homophobia and transphobia. And we've also brought in voices of our friends. So we were really lucky that we got to work with some other brilliant educators out there who obviously we can't speak to everybody's experiences. So we brought in some other people who have written about their experiences. And then at the end of each chapter are actions for young people to take. So there's sort of like a workbook element to it as well. And for me, that was really important because, as it's already been said, teachers were very busy and we wanted to make resources that, you know, could be very practical. So it's like you can buy the book, the students can read the book, you can, you know, photocopy elements of the book, and also there's a PDF so that there are free downloadable resources. So it literally can be a scheme of work sort of ready to go. I think what has been so lovely in terms of feedback is hearing parents that have bought it for their children, but then they said they've sat and read it themselves and learnt so much. So I love the way there's sort of been twofold things happening, and then people have been able to discuss it with their children, and that's been a really beautiful thing to see play out. And also just when people send you pictures of their kids reading the book, like they're just in bed and then there's a picture of them like wrapped up in bed taking it all in, and that's just such a lovely thing. So yeah, it's been a really beautiful experience. I spoke at a school this morning about the book, 600 students, and you're just like, yeah, this is why we do it. So yeah, I've had an amazing experience. So yeah, if you want to get the book, that'd be amazing, and you can download the free resources as well.
Fabulous, thank you. And I love all those multiple hats you're wearing there, and speaking to all those different bits of who we are as educators and humans. And we get it a lot, actually, parents and carers looking for advice and signposting. So the fact that they can all get something from that book, fabulous. Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm going to ping over to Orlene, who I've seen all over my LinkedIn doing her book work in the last few months, back in my patch of South London. So it's great to have you here, Orlene. Please tell us more about your book and the work you've been doing.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks to all the other authors as well. It's still a bit of an unreal moment for me on World Book Day to be talking about my book. So, and it's good to be in such good company as well. I would say I have worked in education for 20 plus years. I'm giving away my age a little bit, and I was a head teacher for 7 of those years. And have done a lot of work kind of local authority wise. So how I managed to get the book published, because actually it's really hard to teach and publish a book. It's really hard to teach and write a book. So I have major props to everyone on here that's managed to do that. But I led the work of decolonising the curriculum for the Hackney syllabus that came out in 2020 to support schools in understanding how to diversify their curriculum. And then I was really lucky to be spotlighted in a Guardian article about that work, and then a publisher contacted me as a result of that article. So that was how I considered writing a book. I never thought I'd have the time. It was always something that I thought I would love to do but would never be able to do. And yeah, I had quite a strict regime to be able to do it, which I'd love to talk about if I had more time. But I think my book was really about I do a lot of training now. I do a lot of work with schools, and actually over the course of the last 4 years, I've been working with teachers who have said to me, what does racism look like in my classroom? Like, I understand, we all understand what kind of conscious hatred or conscious dislike looks like. We all recognise that and see that. We all recognise racial slurs. We recognise kind of any themes that sort of lean towards kind of far right movements, but actually the hidden embedded forms of racism, teachers were saying, actually, we don't know what that looks like in the classroom, and also we don't know how we're contributing to it because we don't know what it looks like. And so a lot of my work was about actually how do I create a book that teaches us to see the bits of racism we've been taught not to see. So all those embedded forms such as microaggressions, tone policing, isolation, ostracization, lower expectations, perceptions of family and narratives. That was really important as part of this book, to ensure that teachers could understand the ways that they may be disrupting racism or maybe upholding it, and not always aware of the fact that they're doing that. So it was really important for me that this book empowered teachers to dismantle inequalities for our most systemically disadvantaged children. And how do we make it visible? That was the main purpose of the book. How do we make it visible? So we're no longer saying we don't believe racism exists in our classroom, but there were a lot of staff that were saying to me, we know that it exists, but we don't always see how it presents in the classroom. And I think also being in education, which is a bit of a vocation, I think people find it very difficult to accept that we may be upholding racism because we're here for every child. We want the best for every child. So actually seeing the ways that we consciously and subconsciously uphold that were really important. And I would say it was, as everyone has said, so I think everyone who's come out of school understands the importance of a practical book that staff can pick up and run with and utilise straight away. So it was really important for me that there were case studies in there of schools that I've worked with who are doing the work of disrupting racism, who are seeing it in the classroom and recognising how to dismantle it. Because actually, one thing that we're really bad at in education is highlighting where it's working well. So it was really important to have the case studies there as an example of approaches that had been tried and tested. There are opportunities for reflection in there. There are resources that you can use and go to kind of further support that work. I'm going to try really hard to stay in the time now. And there's also ways of planning for action. So how do I plan for action? And actually, what does action look like? What can I do, irrespective of the school that I'm in or the commitment from my senior leadership team? What can I do today? What can I do in the next 6 months? And I think ultimately the purpose of the book was, how do we create anti-racist leaders of the future? So it's not about how do we have a book that helps diverse communities in diverse schools. It was about how do we have a book, because actually the less diverse a school is, actually the more important this book is. So I really hope that, I think I have had feedback that it is being utilised, it is practical, it is helping, and hopefully more of the same.
So I can see the name of your books on your T-shirt. Do you have a copy of the book to pop up and hold up to the camera? So the Anti-Racist Classroom. Show us the book jacket. There we go. Just so when you see it in the bookshops, you know what it looks like. So thank you, ORLENE. And we'll come back to some of the things you've mentioned there. Finally, Rachel, tell us all about the book that you published and birthed to the world last year.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I feel very humbled to be in such an impressive company. And there are some obvious resonances and overlaps between my book and ORLENE's and NAOMI's. My book's called Unity in Diversity: How to Achieve Structural Race Equity in Schools. And I thought I'd just say a little bit about how I came to write it. So like ORLENE, I was a head teacher. I was a head teacher for 16 years, firstly of 2 secondary schools, and then for my last 7 years in headship of an all-through school, 4 to 18-year-olds, came late to primary, had an epiphany. And then in 2018, I came out of headship to head up a school improvement organisation's education team of 100 advisors working in school settings, mainstream, special, right across the country, but based in Hertfordshire. And that was quite an eye-opener to me, because I'd always worked in very diverse schools in London. And suddenly I was supporting leaders of schools that might be predominantly or even exclusively white in terms of their pupil population and their staff boards and their governing boards. Coinciding with leaving headship, I was given a copy of Reniero Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And I read it, and it really was a jolt to me, because I thought I was quite racially literate. I'd always taken pride in ensuring a totally inclusive and equitable school for my diverse student and staff populations. But I realised that I'd got so much to learn, and that I was still on the base slopes, and that actually what I'd been guilty of doing sometimes as a leader was creating equality, not equity. And then, of course, you know, closely following my beginning to read and starting to, you know, diversify my reading. And before I knew it, I got bookshelf after bookshelf sort of full of books around race equity, and I was becoming more racially literate. We saw the murder of George Floyd played out on our TV screens as we all sort of sat in lockdown. And my organisation, HFL Education, took a long, hard look at itself and decided that it was going to pledge to do much better by its racially minoritized staff, and to diversify its workforce more, and to do more in the work that we were doing with schools up and down the country around race equity. So I set a programme up, which has now just come to the end of its 3rd year, where school leaders can opt to come onto a programme for a year, meet together for 6 taught days over the course of the year, be lectured and spoken to by some great sort of national keynote speakers, leaders in this field, do school-to-school visits so they can see the work they're doing around race equity. And these are primary schools, secondary schools, mainstream, special, so really sort of diverse, from tiny sort of village nurseries right through to big sort of urban secondary schools. And they also, interestingly and importantly, pledge over the year to write a case study of their learning over the year, and how they're implementing their learning in their schools, and what goes well, and the challenges and setbacks they have. So very quickly, I was getting these amazing sort of case studies that I wanted a way of augmenting and spotlighting. also getting amazing testimony from people of colour who are leaders in schools and settings and trusts. And I decided that I wanted to put them together into a book which pulled together my learning over those years and the experiences of people, leaders that I've been working with. I had that challenge, and I had to talk to myself about whether I had any right or authority as a white, advantaged, privileged woman to write a book on this topic, and to potentially take a book contract away from a person of colour who might have a hell of a lot more right to write. And I asked friends of colour about whether they felt I should do it, and they said, as long as you amplify the voices of people of colour through the book and tell those stories, we think that's okay. And I was finally persuaded by Professor Paul Miller, who I'll never forget, sort of sat me down and said to me, it's not fair that you have privilege and other people don't. It's not fair that you're perhaps more likely to get a book writing contract than other people. But at the end of the day, that's not your fault. And you really have a choice to do nothing with all the learning, or to do something that's, putting yourself in the space of being a white ally. So I did. The book is divided into three sections after a sort of introduction that really lays out the problem and the issues and shows the racial inequity that we've got in our system structurally and in our education provision. It has a section around how to talk to young people of all ages about race and how to grow the racial literacy of your staff, with lots of case studies and examples. Then it has a section around diversifying and decolonising the curriculum, with, again, lots of examples and case studies from primary and secondary schools about how they've gone about it, and some of the sort of wonky bits and things that have gone wrong, as well as some of the success stories. But then perhaps where it's slightly different from Orlene's book, it has a third section, which is about recruiting, developing and retaining staff, governors, trustees of colour. And again, lots of sort of practical top tips about how to do that, because, as I say, a lot of the schools I'm working with are really struggling in that area. Like, I think, practically all the books we've heard about so far this evening, it has the voices of people with lived experience. It has a lot of case studies and practical examples, and each chapter ends with activities that you could do in staff training, in a staff meeting, audit tools, reflections for leaders, reflections for teachers, reflections for governors and trustees. So it's designed to be a practical tool for school leaders, trust leaders, setting leaders, but also teachers and governors.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. I think you've picked up there that one of the core threads from what you've all shared is the idea of action, and how we activate people and give people practical tools. So let me loop back to some of you. Audience, please do pop questions and comments into the chat. If you have specific questions for the panel, please type them and I can verbalise them for you. Otherwise, I'm going to freestyle it, which I'm quite comfortable doing. So Adam and Joe, let me come back to you two, because I am really curious about this idea of moving from like having conversations on a podcast to translate them into a book, because our tone, our rhetoric is quite different. Sort of like when we're not scripting it, and then when you see it written down. And my follow-up question to that is also around the kind of the safety of what we share on a podcast, and then seeing it in print. I'm sure you had to navigate that with some of your contributors. So between Joe then Adam, do you want to both sort of like tag team on that answer?
That second part of the question was really important to us, because we're sharing the lived experiences, the lives of tens and tens of LGBT plus educators, and we wanted to make sure that what we were sharing felt accurate and real and right to their experience. So we took that really seriously. When I was writing the in practice section of these chapters, I listened back to the podcast. I listened to people speak several times over the course of kind of a few months, and tried to write into words. I didn't want to directly quote them. That didn't feel right. I wanted to write into words kind of what their experiences were. And then every story, every anecdote that is shared within the book, we then checked those with every individual to make sure they were happy with them. There was amendments and changes that came in, and every story, anecdote, or time when a person's voice is shared within the story has been approved by them, and is kind of written in a way that they were part of that journey.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Joe said. Like, it's such a privilege to have the opportunity to amplify the voices of people, but it's also that massive responsibility. So we were really careful in terms of being selective about the things that we chose, but also recognizing that, you know, taking them out of context didn't lose the value and the meaning, and having that feedback loop. Not only did we speak to each person whose story we shared, there was several people we trusted who read drafts for us, like Professor Catherine Lee, and she was a great help during the book in terms of signposting and giving us a steer on that. So yeah, so I think just trying to be as authentic as we can to the voices of the people we shared, and I feel like also discussing sensitive topics. We were conscious that, you know, at this current political climate, there's some pile-on sometimes when you discuss certain things linked to LGBT. So we were really, really careful about making sure what we were talking about was either factual or backed up by evidence. And so far, partly through luck and partly through being very, very careful, we've not really had much backlash. So long may that continue.
Well on both for creating that space, but also like creating that safety as well. Let me swing over to you then, Naomi, because I am curious about this idea of the two sisters having an Instagram account. I'm not great on Instagram. Instagram's where I put my holiday photos, but I know it is like the place to be for a lot of these conversations. And like making that bridge from quite short form on Insta, quite visual form, into longer form. How do you navigate that as a duo?
Yeah, we'd already written a book together previously. So our first book was called The Mixed Race Experience, which is for more sort of young adults and adults. And we did that in a really different way, actually. We'd already decided all the chapter headings. And then we just went away and had like a live Google Doc and would just add all these things to it. And we also interviewed people and had transcripts. So that kind of was done that way. But this one, actually, Natalie went away and did a whole first draft of the book. In fact, I did some, and we sent it back to the editors because I'd never written for this age group specifically, and they were like, "Oh no." You've written way I think I'd written for adults still. So Natalie was like, I think that I know the tone, and she went and did it and it was brilliant. And so I was like, okay, right, you've given me a great model here. So after she had kind of gone away and done it, and then I went back over and added to it and did some editing and reviewing and things like that. And also she's dyslexic, so one of the things that she does is she gets all her ideas down on paper, and then because I'm English and drama teacher, she'll like give it to me, and then I'll go and rework some things and help her with some of the spelling and punctuation and grammar and stuff. So we do make quite a good team in that respect. So it did work quite well. And then we had 4 guest authors, so they went away and literally just wrote their sections and then sent them back into us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Orlene, you referenced in your 5 minutes that if you had more time, you'd like to talk about the time management, the self-discipline of writing. I think that's where you were going. Do you want to just share a little bit about that? Because the workload is excessive, and I think it puts a lot of people off. So how do you manage it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because when I met my editor and I had to sort of submit my proposal, she basically said to me, she was great actually. First of all, I'd say that I would really like to say that I had an editor who, she's of mixed race heritage. So there were things that I knew that she understood about the work that I was trying to do and about the challenges that I might face or the barriers in doing that. So she was fantastic. And she said to me, right, so you're going to write it in a year, so I'm going to go away and then come back in a year. And I was like, oh, no. I'm not doing that. You're not going anywhere in a year. I can't. I need feedback. I'm a teacher. I'm trained to give feedback. I need constant feedback. So she asked me to kind of think about it. And in the end, I said, because it was so new to me, that I would be much more comfortable if I got a clear steer from the very first chapter that I was speaking in the right way and to the right audience. So what we actually did is that I wrote a chapter every month. I would go to the library on a Saturday by myself for 6 hours. And every Saturday I would just sit and write, and I would create a chapter every month, which I would then send to her, get live feedback, which would then help me going forward and gave me the confidence. So that was because I had an editor that was I was able to say to her, I don't think that writing it for a year and coming back is going to be is going to work for me. I'm quite scared that won't do me well. And she was very open to that. And then we found a process that worked. And because I'm a mother of 3, I had to do it that way. I couldn't have to go away and come back a year later. I'm worried that I would have turned up with nothing in a year. So
I love that, because I think that chunking of it, it's a bit like having a gym buddy, isn't it? It's an accountability buddy to make sure you actually get up on a Saturday and go and get on your bike or whatever it is you're doing. So I do like that. And I know that different authors have different experiences with their editors, and some can be quite hands off. And if you need that kind of discipline, it's picking your publisher and picking your editor wisely, isn't it? Thank you. Last question then to Rachel. Rachel, it's a question that's come from one of the authors who's going to join us later on. You talked very openly and vulnerably there about the kind of the dilemma you grappled with about being a white author, about racial literacy. So the question is, how was your book received by the Black community? We know there's a lot being published at the moment about the lack of Black characters, Black authors, Black creators. So how's it landed? How's it resonated with your target audience?
Yeah, great question. So I think I was very upfront in the forward addressing that, in what I basically said earlier, but in a lot more detail, the dilemma and why I'd come to the conclusion that I should write the book. I was also really fortunate that I had a lot of endorsements and nice little sound bites about the book from prominent people of racially minoritized groups. I had a lovely quote from David Lammy on the cover, had an endorsement from Paul Miller, from Sufyan Sadiq, and a number of other really eminent and well-respected Black leaders in the field. I made the decision that I would interview and tell the stories interwoven through the book of 10 educators of colour, some of who've been head teachers or governors or subject teachers of different ages and with different experiences through the book. So there is a huge amount of telling the stories of people of colour in the book. You hear much less of my voice. But at places you do hear my voice, because I think white leaders sometimes need to be told by other white leaders, it's vital you do this, and it will be uncomfortable and you'll make mistakes and you'll take 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But, this is really important to do. We need everybody to be saying this, don't we? We need people of all backgrounds and all colours doing this. So it has gone down really well. I mean, I get booked often by white majority or exclusively white senior leadership teams to come and do work with them, because they say, we actually think it's powerful that a white person tells us what we should be doing in this space. But I also make sure that they're always backing that up with systemic and ongoing work with people with real lived experience. But I think the fact that there are a lot of case studies and a lot of stories of people of colour woven through the book probably helps with that.
Thank you for that, because I think it is just that tightrope, isn't it, that you navigate, but the mindfulness and the consciousness around it. And I think being that door opener to bring white people in who are a bit worried about what might happen in that conversation, you're almost laying the ground actually for other speakers and other trainers to come in. You might have noticed we had to boot out Joe and Adam. We are at capacity in our studio, so we wanted to make sure that our next authors were able to pull through, so we have a good transition. So a massive thank you to the authors who joined us for panel 1. You can see Rachel, Orlene and Naomi are still here. Joe and Adam, who just disappeared. Thank you for writing your books, for publishing your books, being part of our community, and we will continue to amplify the brilliant work you're doing. So please go and enjoy the rest of your World Book Day evening. We'll look forward to seeing you all soon.